The spirit of whoredoms hath caused them to err. This will be the fourth and hopefully last post I'll do, which is specifically dedicated to addressing the biblical principle of polygamy and the insidious spiritual wife doctrine that grew out of it during the Nauvoo period. Although I first covered the whoredoms that overtook the church in Nauvoo in the final part of the tribute to Sidney Rigdon, I have since posted 4 others that specifically address this topic. The first paper on the spiritual wife doctrine approached the subject from some personal experiences my wife and I had trying to sort things out about polygamy early in our marriage. The second post resulted in a doctrinal critique of section 132. The third post I did pertaining to it grew out of the Morley Farm series. It viewed the evolution of the doctrine through the eyes of the events of the LDS Foundation movement and postulated that the introduction of biblical polygamy was associated with the restoration of the Gospel of Abraham in 1836. In it, I speculate that the patriarchal law of plural wives, which is associated with a covenant which made with Abraham, may have been acceptable to live under certain conditions under the law of Abraham. Nevertheless, it's a lesser law, and it appears to have been a cursing to the marriages of all that lived it. Just as Sarah's desire to have Hagar bear the seed of Abraham was a cursing to the marriage of Sarah and Abraham. The fourth post contained several observations from Mrs. Watcher from the Book of Mormon and the Old Testament, which supported the conclusions made in the previous posts. Among other things, that post revealed that some Bible scholars do not believe Abraham was even a polygamist. Regardless of whether he was or not, he did not have many wives, and he did not have many concubines. Therefore, the opening verse in section 132 becomes even more problematic than originally pointed out in my critique of section 132. Lastly, I want to approach this subject in this post through the eyes of ancient prophecy. The ancient prophets saw our day and knew that sexual whoredom was a result of spiritual unfaithfulness to God, would be one of the great stumbling blocks of the Latter-day Saints. You'll recall from the tribute I did to Sidney Rigdon that when the spiritual wife doctrine crept into the church, Sidney Rigdon rejected it. He was one of, if not the greatest biblical scholar of his time, and God had commissioned him to prove the revelations Joseph Smith brought forth using the words of the ancient prophets. The following declaration by Sidney Rigdon proves one of the greatest keys for identifying a prophetic contextual understanding of the whoredoms that inflicted the Latter-day Saints. When it became apparent that Joseph Smith was involved in this practice and leading others into it, Sidney's assessment of the situation was simple and to the point. Quote, "Joseph has contracted a whoring spirit," end of quote. Rigdon also stated that, quote, "he'd known for some years that Joseph had not been led by the Spirit of God, and gave this as the reason why he did not attend with him as his counselor," end of quote. The following statements from the Lord's spokesman published in a newspaper provide a good explanation of how he felt about the spiritual wife doctrine. Pittsburgh, October 15, 1844. Brother J. Gregg. Dear Sir, yours of the 14th inst. was received per mail this morning. I've been informed, since Mr. Page published his bull and subsequent departure from this place, that he had attempted to teach this doctrine of spiritual wives in this city some time since. This will account for his sudden departure from both this place and yours. It would seem almost impossible that there could be found a set of men and women in this age of the world, with the revelations of God in their hands, who could invent and propagate doctrines so ruinous to society, so debasing and demoralizing as the doctrine of a man having a plurality of wives. Those who read the New Testament with care cannot avoid seeing that the apostles have declared that a corruption like that we complain of was to make its appearance in the last days. See 2 Timothy 3rd chapter, from the 1st to the 9th verse inclusive. These sayings which the apostles at Nauvoo have applied to the professing world are as applicable to themselves as to any others now living, or any others who have lived since the days of Paul. In the 6th verse we are told that, quote, "For of this sort are they which creep into houses and lead captive silly women laden with sins, led away with divers lusts." End of quote. That the 12 and their adherents have entered into their houses and led silly women astray is a fact susceptible of the highest proof, and we are authorized by Paul to apply all the rest he has said to them. Quote, "For if this sort enter into houses and lead astray silly women, what sort?" we ask. The before described religionists, for says Paul, they have a form of godliness. End of quote. The conclusion then is that they effected the ruin of silly females by or through a form of godliness. It's a fact so well known that the 12 and their adherents have endeavored to carry the spiritual wife business in secret that I hardly need mention it here, and have gone to the most shameful and desperate lengths to keep it from the public. First, insulting innocent females, and when they resent to the insult, these monsters in human shape would assail their characters by lying and perjuries with a multitude of desperate men to help them effect the ruin of those whom they had insulted, and all this to enable them to keep these corrupt practices from the view of the world. No falsehood too great and no perjury too daring in order to conceal these heaven-daring abuses of mankind. Yours respectfully, Sidney Rigdon. Sidney obviously saw fulfillment of New Testament prophecies taking place. Perhaps one of the most cryptically profound things that Sidney uttered was that Joseph had contracted a whoring spirit. Remember, Sidney was a walking Bible. When he spoke, he'd often paraphrase or use similar phrases as the ancient prophets. The words he uttered were carefully chosen. Go to the LDS word cruncher and punch in those two words, whoring spirit, and it will lead you to two references. One of them is found in the book of Hosea. Quote, "My people asked counsel at their stocks, and their staff declared unto them, for the spirit of whoredom hath caused them to err, and they've gone a whoring from under their God. Therefore your daughters shall commit whoredom, and your spouses shall commit adultery, for the spirit of whoredom is in the midst of them." End of quote. That's Hosea 4. This is the perfect description of what was happening in Nauvoo. A lustful spirit of whoredom overcame the saints as they entered into adulterous relationships. As hard as it is to believe that latter-day Israel could become so corrupted after having been given so much light, they had done exactly what the ancient children of Israel had done. How can this happen? The answer is in the same chapter. Quote, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me. Seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God, I will also forget thy children." End of quote. Hosea provides one of the more clear and concise commentaries on the Latter-day Saints. The entire book of Hosea is a commentary on how Ephraim struggles with a whoring spirit anciently and in the latter days. There are parts of the narrative that so clearly describe what was going on in the Nauvoo era of the Foundation movement, it's absolutely heartbreaking to compare the LDS history with the commentary in Hosea. Perhaps one of the most poignant examples of what Hosea is speaking about was when Apostle Willard Richards shacked up with Apostle Orson Hyde's wife while Hyde was on a mission. Quote, "Willard Richards nailed down the windows and fired off his revolver in the street after dark, and commenced living with Mrs. Nancy Miranda Hyde." Letter from Ebenezer Robinson.